My name is Elias Navarro. I'm 36 years old and I've spent the last 8 years working trail restoration contracts in the Cascades, mostly around Packwood, Washington. The work is simple. Regrade eroded switchbacks, reset old survey stakes after winter storms, clear blowdowns so the Forest Service can keep their maps honest. I'm good at being alone. I'm better at staying quiet. And up until late autumn of 2014, I thought I understood what silence actually sounded like. The contract came through Mabel Jensen, a retired Forest Service surveyor who still owned a cabin off Forest Road 46. She was in her 70s, sharp as a new compass bearing, and she hired me to relocate a series of boundary stakes along a decommissioned fire road that had been chewed up by mudslides the previous spring. The road hadn't seen vehicle traffic since the mid-90s, and most of the markers were either buried or washed downslope into the timber. It was grunt work, GPS in one hand, flagging tape in the other, eyes on the ground for 6 to 8 hours a day. I set up my base camp in a flat clearing about 2 miles in from the gate. Just a dome tent, a cook kit, a weather radio, and my truck parked far enough back that I could hike in each morning without burning fuel. The fall colors were already turning, vine maple gone blood orange, huckleberry bronze, the sword fern still green but edged with frost every dawn. It was beautiful in the way that makes you forget other people exist. The first weird thing happened on day 3. I was resetting a stake near the edge of a ravine when I heard it, a burst of static, sharp and clean, like someone had keyed a radio and let it hiss for 3 seconds before cutting out. I stopped, one hand still on the rebar I'd been driving into the soil, and listened. Nothing. Just whined through the hemlocks, a distant raven, the ticking of my cheap Casio watch. I wrote it off as interference, maybe a park ranger on a nearby ridge, maybe some hiker with a walkie-talkie. But it happened again that night, and this time I was sure. I was sitting in my tent with my weather radio on, listening to the no-way forecast loop out of Seattle. The voice was calm, mechanical, repeating the usual. Partly cloudy skies, overnight lows in the upper 30s, winds light and variable. Then between loops there was a gap, dead air for maybe 5 seconds, and in that gap I heard it again. Static, but not random. It was rhythmic, almost pulsed, like Morse code slowed down and stripped of meaning. 3 bursts, pause, 2 bursts, pause, then silence. I turned the squelch knob. I changed frequencies. Nothing. The regular forecast resumed as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was crosstalk, some quirk of the ionosphere bouncing signals off the peaks. But the next morning, I heard it again. This time in broad daylight, no radio on, just me in the forest. 3 bursts, 2 bursts, pause. It was coming from upslope, maybe 100 yards into the timber where the old-growth Douglas firs stood like cathedral columns. I followed it. I know that sounds stupid. You'll hear something weird in the woods, you mark it and move on. But I've been doing this work long enough to know the difference between animal, weather, and human. This wasn't any of those. It was too regular, too patient. I found the first trail camera about 40 yards in. It was wedged high in the crotch of an alder, maybe 8 feet off the ground. And the first thing I noticed was that the lens was facing backward, pressed right up against the bark like someone had mounted it to photograph the tree itself. The casing was a standard Bushnell, the kind you'd buy at any sporting goods store, olive drab with a camouflage pattern. But wrapped around it, binding it to the branch, was something I didn't recognize at first. It looked like braided grass. Thin, tight, woven with the kind of precision you'd see in basket weaving or old climbing rope. Except it wasn't just grass. There were darker strands mixed in, coarser, thicker, almost like horsehair or coarse human hair. It didn't smell rotten. It smelled green, like fresh-cut fern and wet stone. I pulled the camera down carefully, unwinding the braid without tearing it. The battery compartment was still sealed. The SD card slot had the little orange tab sticking out, which meant there was a card inside. I should have left it there, should have flagged it, reported it, walked away. But I didn't. I popped the card, slipped it into my pocket, and took the camera with me. That night, back at camp, I plugged the SD card into my laptop, a beat-up Dell I kept in a Pelican case for exactly this kind of field work. The card had over 400 photos on it. I opened the first one, bark, just bark. Close-up lichen, cambium texture, a knot that looked like an eye. Second photo, same thing. Third, fourth, fifth. Nothing but tree skin, shot after shot, like someone was documenting the surface of that alder with the obsessive focus of a forensic photographer. Then I got to frame 206. The angle had shifted slightly. The lens was still pressed to the bark, but there was a gap now, maybe half an inch, and in that gap, reflected in the curve of the bark's moisture, I saw a shape, broad, hunched. The brow was too heavy, the shoulders too wide, and in one hand, extended toward the lens, was something small and rectangular. A broken lens cap, maybe, or a shard of mirror. It was holding it like it was looking at itself. I closed the laptop. My hands were shaking, not from cold. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the weather radio on low, and twice I heard that static pattern again. 3, 2, pause. I turned on my headlamp and unzipped the tent flap, but the clearing was empty. Just my truck, just the fire ring I hadn't used, just the dark line of trees pressing in on all sides. In the morning, I found the compass. It was sitting on a flat stone about 10 feet from my tent, right where I'd have to step over it to reach the trail. It was an old Silva model, the kind with the liquid-filled housing and the rotating bezel. But the needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning, slowly, clockwise. Every few seconds it would pause, quiver, then continue its lazy rotation like it was caught in a weak magnetic eddy. I picked it up. The housing was intact, no cracks, no leaks. But when I turned it over, I saw the scratches. The faceplate, the clear plastic window over the dial, was covered in concentric rings, hair-thin, etched with something sharp and patient. They spiraled inward toward the pivot point, and when I held the compass up to the light, I realized what they were doing. They were retraining the needle, biasing it. The scratches had been placed with such precision that the needle was no longer reading the Earth's magnetic field. It was reading the field created by the pattern itself, a false north carved into the tool. I set it back down on the stone. I didn't want to carry it. I didn't want to know who had done that, or how long it had taken, or what it meant. But I did take a photo of it with my phone, a cheap LG flip model with a 2-megapixel camera that I only kept for emergencies. The image was grainy, but clear enough. I could see the spiral. I could see the stone. And in the corner of the frame, just barely visible, I could see a single toe print in the damp soil beside the stone. It was at least 6 inches wide. That afternoon, I decided to test something. I walked back to my truck, grabbed my handheld GPS, a Garmin eTrex that I'd had since 2010, and powered it on. I let it acquire satellites. Then I saved a waypoint at my current position. I labeled it Camp. Then I turned the unit off, wrapped it in a bandana, and placed it on the same flat stone where the compass had been. Next to it, I left 3 things: a dead AA battery from my headlamp, an old Motorola Razr flip phone with a cracked screen that I'd found in my glove box, and the compass with the scratched face. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say anything out loud. I just set them down like an offering and walked away. I spent the rest of the day working the upper boundary line, resetting stakes, and trying not to think about what I was doing, trying not to imagine something large and careful stepping out of the timber, kneeling beside that stone, and considering what I'd left behind. When I got back to camp at dusk, the stone was empty. The AA battery was gone. The Razr was still there, but the cracked screen had been polished. I don't know how else to describe it. The spiderweb fracture was still there, but the surface was clean, reflective, like someone had buffed it with fine grit and oil until it shone like black glass. The compass was still there too. But now both sides of the faceplate carried the spiral scratches, front and back, mirrored, concentric, perfect, and the GPS was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at that stone, feeling the temperature drop and the shadows stretch and the forest go quiet in that way it does right before full dark. No birds, no squirrels, no wind. Then I heard it, a single soft click, plastic on wood, rhythmic, deliberate. I turned. At the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 yards into the timber, I saw 2 things. The first was a branch, about head height, where 2 strands of braided grass had been tied in a loose knot. The ends hung down like a pointer, angled toward the slope that led into the ravine. The second was my GPS. It was sitting on a nurse log, screen facing up, powered on. The backlight glowed faint green in the twilight. I walked over slowly and picked it up. The waypoint I'd saved, camp, was still there. But now there was a track log active, a breadcrumb trail of recorded positions. I opened it. The track formed a perfect loop. It started at the stone where I'd left the unit, circled my tent in a broad arc, maybe 15 feet out from the guy lines, then traced a path into the timber, upslope, and back to the nurse log where I'd just found it. The time stamps ran from 11:43 p.m. to 12:18 a.m. While I'd been asleep, something had taken my GPS, walked a slow circle around my tent in the dark, carried it into the forest, and returned it to a place where I'd be sure to find it. And it had left me a sign. I looked back at the braided grass pointer. It swayed once, gently, though there was no wind. I didn't follow it that night. I went back to my tent, zipped myself in, and sat with my back to the center pole and my knife in my lap until the sky went gray. But in the morning, I made a choice. I was going to follow the sign. I was going to see what was down in that ravine. And I was going to find out what or who was teaching themselves to use our technology better than we ever did. Because I was starting to understand something. They weren't stealing our tools. They were studying them, translating them, turning them into a language we'd forgotten how to speak. And that scared me more than anything I'd ever found in the woods. I gave myself one rule. I would not go down into that ravine armed with anything that could be mistaken for a threat. No knife on my belt, no bear spray clipped to my pack strap, not even a hatchet for clearing brush. If something that big and that careful wanted me gone, a 4-inch blade wasn't going to change the outcome. And if it wanted to communicate, I needed to show up with empty hands. So I left everything at camp except my water bottle, a small notebook, a pencil, and my phone. Still that old LG flip model with the terrible camera. I didn't bring the GPS. That felt important. It had been taken, studied, and returned. Bringing it back would have been like showing up to a conversation with a recording device. Rude, maybe dangerous. The braided grass pointer was still hanging from the branch at the edge of the clearing. Both strands angled downslope toward the thick timber. In the morning light, I could see details I'd missed the night before. The weave wasn't random. It alternated between two tones, light and dark, in a pattern that reminded me of old Salish basketwork. The dark strands were definitely hair, coarse and kinked, and when I leaned close I caught that same smell, fresh fern, wet stone, and something else underneath. Musk, maybe. Not rotten, just wild. I stepped past the pointer and started down. The slope was steep, littered with sword ferns and salal that grabbed at my pant legs. Nurse logs crisscrossed the descent like fallen bridges, their backs covered in moss thick enough to muffle footsteps. I moved slowly, placing each boot carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. The Douglas firs up here were old, trunks 4 and 5 feet across, bark furrowed deep enough to hide your hand. The canopy was so dense that even though it was nearly 9 in the morning, the light came down in scattered coins, gray, green, and cold. About 50 yards in, I found the second sign. Another braid, this one looped around a young hemlock at chest height. It was tied in a figure-8 knot, and hanging from the bottom loop was something small and metallic. I stopped, crouched down, and looked without touching. It was an earbud, just one. White plastic, the kind that came with old iPods or cheap MP3 players. The wire had been cut clean, and the rubber tip was missing, but the metal speaker grill was still intact, and something, had threaded the wire through the braid and tied it off with a square knot so precise it could have come from a sailing manual. I looked up. The hemlock's trunk was straight and branchless for the first 15 feet, which meant whatever had tied this had either climbed or reached from above. I scanned the canopy. Nothing. Just the slow creak of wood and the distant tap of a woodpecker working a snag. I kept moving. The third sign was 20 yards further, a small cairn of river stones stacked beside a rotting stump. On top of the cairn sat a watch. I recognized the style immediately. A cheap Timex Ironman digital, the kind runners wore in the 90s. The wristband was gone, and the display was cracked, but the watch had been placed face up, deliberately, like an offering on an altar. I picked it up. The battery was dead, so the screen was blank. But when I turned it over, I saw that the back panel had been pried off. The tiny circuit board inside was missing. All that remained were the plastic casing, the cracked crystal, and 4 small screws arranged in a perfect square on the stump beside the cairn. Someone had disassembled it, carefully, with tools or patience or both. I put the watch back exactly where I'd found it and wiped my fingerprints off the crystal with my sleeve. I don't know why. It just felt like the right thing to do. The air was getting colder as I descended, and the ground was starting to level out. I could hear water now, a creek, probably seasonal, moving somewhere off to my left. And then I saw it. The cedar. It had been a giant once, maybe 8 feet across at the base, but a windstorm had taken it down years ago. The root ball had torn up out of the earth and now stood vertical, a 15-foot wall of dirt and stone and frozen wood. The trunk stretched downslope for at least 60 feet, and where the roots had ripped free, they'd left a cavity, a hollow space beneath the upturned mass, sheltered on 3 sides, open to the south. And someone had made it into something. I stopped 30 feet away, breathing shallow, every nerve sharp. The entrance was low, maybe 3 feet high, framed by the curve of 2 massive roots that arced overhead like ribs. Across the threshold, a layer of fresh ferns had been laid down, overlapping like shingles, green and deliberate. It wasn't debris, it was a floor. I called out, not loud, just enough. "Hello?" The word hung in the air for a moment, then fell flat. No echo. The forest swallowed it. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. I crouched and moved toward the entrance, stopping just outside. The ferns smelled clean, bruised green, like they'd been cut that morning. I placed one hand on the root arch, steadying myself, and leaned forward to look inside. It took my eyes a moment to adjust. The space was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 10 feet deep, 6 feet wide, tall enough in the center that I could sit upright if I tucked my head. The walls weren't dirt. They'd been lined with stripped branches, woven tight in a lattice pattern that looked structural, intentional. The light that came through was soft, filtered through gaps in the root system above, and it gave everything a dim underwater glow. But it was what hung from the walls that stopped my breath. There were dozens of them, maybe more, objects suspended from braided cords strung between the lattice branches like a museum gallery designed by something that understood order, but not human purpose. I pulled off my boots. I don't know why that felt important, but it did. I left them outside, stepped onto the fern mat in my wool socks, and crouched low as I moved inside. The first thing I saw up close was a pair of earbuds, both this time tangled together, their wires tied into perfect figure-8 knots and hung from a loop of braided grass. The white plastic was scuffed but clean, no corrosion, no mud. Next to that, a Polaroid photograph pinned to the lattice with a splinter of bone. I leaned closer. The photo showed a trailhead. I recognized the style, one of those wooden Forest Service signs with the carved letters and the map under plexiglass. But every human figure in the frame had been scratched off. I could see the shape of a hiker in the foreground, but the face and torso were gone. Scraped away with something sharp, a shell maybe, or a tooth. The trees in the background were untouched. The sign was untouched. Only the people had been erased. I felt my throat tighten. Further along the wall, a compass, not the one I'd left on the stone. This was older, a brass-cased Brunton with a cracked sighting mirror. The needle had been removed entirely, and in its place, a single strand of wire had been coiled into a tight spiral and glued down with tree sap. Then I saw the watches. 4 of them hung in a row, all digital, all with their minute hands removed, or, in the case of the digitals, their displays pried open and the segments rearranged. One showed only the hour dots. Another had been reassembled so the numbers displayed backward. A third had the screen turned 90 degrees and glued back in sideways. They were freezing time, or rotating it, or teaching themselves how we tried to cage it. I moved deeper. On the right wall, a cluster of SD cards threaded onto a single strand of braided grass like beads on a rosary. I counted 8 of them. Different brands, different capacities, all strung together and hung at eye height. When I brushed them with my finger, they clicked softly against each other, a dry ceramic sound. Beneath them, a small pile of batteries, AAs, AIAs, a single 9-volt, all arranged in a grid on a flat piece of bark. They weren't corroded. They'd been cleaned, sorted by size. The terminals faced the same direction. Then I saw the radios, 3 of them mounted side by side on a horizontal branch that had been lashed into the lattice like a display shelf. The first was a Noe weather radio, the same model I had back at camp. The battery door was missing, and the guts had been exposed. Copper coils, circuit board, speaker cone. But the coils had been unwound and rewound tighter, smaller, bound with some kind of fiber that looked like sinew. The speaker cone had been removed entirely. The second radio was older, a transistor AM/FM unit with a telescoping antenna. The antenna had been extended fully and lashed upright with thread-thin cordage. Hanging from the tip of the antenna was a small bundle of dried grass that moved slightly in the air current, like a weather vane. The third radio was just a shell. Everything inside had been taken out, but the empty cavity had been filled with moss, packed tight, and the battery compartment had been stuffed with tiny white stones. They weren't breaking them. They were translating them, turning them into something else, something that still worked, but not for us. I was halfway to the back of the space when I saw the mosaic. It covered the entire rear wall, a broad oval shape, maybe 5 feet across and 4 feet tall, positioned exactly at eye level if you were crouching. It was made of screens, dead screens, black screens, phone displays, old GPS units, the faceplate of a digital camera, the screen from a portable DVD player, maybe 30 or 40 of them, all arranged in overlapping layers like scales or shingles, each one angled slightly to catch the dim light filtering down from above. And when I moved, they reflected me, not as a single image, as fragments, 100 small black mirrors, each one showing a piece: my jaw, my shoulder, the curve of my forehead, the edge of my hand. I was broken apart and repeated, faceted, like I was looking at myself through the compound eye of an insect. I reached out slowly and touched one of the screens. It was cold, smooth. The glass was intact. Behind me, I heard it, a footstep, not on the forest floor, on the fern mat, inside the space, behind me. I froze. The air changed, warmer, heavier. The smell hit me. Fern, stone, musk, and something else. Breath. Large, slow, controlled. I didn't turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be the wrong move. So I stayed still. I kept my hand on the screen. And I waited. The breathing continued, deep, rhythmic, close enough that I could feel the displacement of air against the back of my neck. Then I heard the click. Plastic on wood, the same sound I'd heard at camp. Tap, 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 tap. A pause. Then, from somewhere behind me and above, a soft, mechanical whir. I knew that sound. I'd heard it 1,000 times. A camera shutter, old, manual, film advance. Something was photographing me. I closed my eyes and spoke quietly, barely a whisper. I'm not here to take anything. Silence. Then another click. Closer, to my left now. I turned my head slowly, just enough to see from the corner of my eye. There was a shape in the entrance, blocking the light, broad across the shoulders. The head was crested, heavy-browed. It was crouched, motionless, one long arm extended toward the lattice wall. In its hand, and I will swear to this, it held a small disposable camera, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore, yellow and black cardboard, Kodak fun-saver. It turned the camera toward me and pressed the button. Flash! I flinched, and the shape pulled back, out of the entrance, fast and silent. By the time I crawled out into the gray light, Boots still in hand, the forest was empty. But on the nurse log where I'd found my GPS the night before, there was something new. The disposable camera. Set down carefully. The film counter on the back showed 27 exposures remaining, and next to it, arranged in a small crescent, were 3 objects I'd left on the stone 2 days before: the dead AA battery, the polished razor, and the compass with the double spiral scratches. But there was one more thing: a coil of copper wire, thin, bright, stripped clean, wound into a loose spiral and placed on top of the camera like a ribbon on a gift. I picked it up. It was warm, and as I stood there, the forest around me utterly still, I heard it one more time. Distant, high on the ridge, carried on wind I couldn't feel. 3 bursts of static, 2 bursts. Pause. Then beneath it, something new. My own voice, broken into syllables, played backward, then forward, slow, deliberate. Not here to take, here to take anything. They were learning me, and I realized, with a cold clarity that made my hand shake, that I had no idea how long they'd been listening. I didn't go back to the gallery for 5 days, not because I was afraid, though I was, but because I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with. So I did what any halfway rational person would do when confronted with evidence that something in the forest was reverse engineering human technology. I started asking questions, carefully, quietly, to people who'd been out here longer than I had. Mabel Jensen was the first person I called. I drove back into Packwood, bought a breakfast sandwich at the gas station, and sat in her gravel driveway for 10 minutes, rehearsing what I'd say. When I finally knocked, she opened the door with a dish towel in one hand and a look that told me she'd been expecting me. "You found something," she said. Not a question. I nodded. She poured me coffee, and I told her a version of the truth. I left out the gallery, the mosaic, the camera, but I told her about the trail cam facing backward, the compass with the scratched face, the GPS track that circled my tent in the middle of the night. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her mug down and looked at me for a long time. "How much do you know about the old fire road surveys?" she asked. "Just what you told me. Decommissioned in '96, unstable slopes, low usage." That's the official story. She stood and walked to a drawer in the kitchen. She pulled out a folded topographic map, old and soft from handling, and spread it on the table between us. "The real reason they closed it is because crews kept losing equipment. Radios, flagging, a couple of handheld compasses, even a theodolite. Do you know how much one of those costs?" I shook my head. "Thousands, and it disappeared off a tripod during a lunch break. Crew came back, and it was gone. No footprints, no drag marks, just gone." She tapped the map. They wrote it off as theft, but 3 weeks later, a trail volunteer found it hanging in a tree 2 miles off-grid. The lens was facing backward, same as your camera, and the leveling screws had been removed and rearranged into a perfect triangle on the ground below. My stomach tightened. Did they report it? Officially, no, but word got around. Folks started saying the forest didn't want to be measured anymore. She pulled the dish towel through her hands, slow and deliberate. I didn't think much of it until my husband lost his radio. I leaned forward. "You mentioned that before, 1989, right?" She nodded. "We were scouting a relocation for a trail connector up near Butter Creek. He set his pack down to check a benchmark, and when he came back, the radio was gone. We searched for an hour. Nothing." She paused. 2 weeks later, I found it on our porch rail, wrapped in braided grass, battery gone, copper coil pulled out and polished like jewelry. Did you see who left it? No, but the grass smelled like cedar and river stone, and there were toe prints in the frost, just the toes, like something had been up on the balls of its feet, trying not to leave weight. She folded the map back up. My husband wanted to report it. I told him no one would believe us, so we buried it in a drawer and didn't talk about it again. Why are you telling me now? She met my eyes. Because you're the first person who's asked the right way. And because you're going back, aren't you? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. As I stood to leave, she said one more thing. They take what tells on them, Elias. Compasses, radios, cameras, anything that tracks or records or makes the invisible visible, and they don't destroy it. She looked out the window toward the timber. They make it tell on us instead. I spent the next 3 days gathering reports. I didn't call it research. I called it checking in with the community. I stopped by the ranger station and asked about lost equipment. I bought a beer for a trail crew supervisor at the tavern and let him talk. I called a wildlife biologist I'd worked with 2 years prior and asked if she'd ever had camera traps go missing. The answer every time was yes, but the pattern was specific. It wasn't random theft, it was selection. The missing items were always the same categories: navigation tools, recording devices, and anything with a reflective surface. Compasses, handheld radios, trail cameras, old film cameras, watches, earbuds. One guy even reported losing a bike mirror off his handlebar while his bike was leaning against a tree during a water break. And in almost every case, the item either reappeared in a strange location, often hung in a tree or placed on a stump, or it was found disassembled, cleaned, and deliberately displayed. One story stuck with me. A search and rescue volunteer named Colin told me that during a recovery operation in 2012, his team had set up a base camp with a portable weather station, a little unit with an anemometer, a thermometer, and a digital readout. They left it running overnight. In the morning, the anemometer was gone. The cups had been unscrewed from the spindle, and the spindle itself had been tied to a low branch with braided cord, positioned so it would rotate in the wind. Beneath it, the 3 plastic cups were arranged in a triangle on a flat rock. It was like someone wanted to see how it worked, Colin said. But they didn't need the readout. They just wanted the movement. That's when I started to understand they weren't stealing our technology because they wanted what it did for us. They were translating it, stripping it down to its essential function and rebuilding it into something that worked with the forest instead of against it. A compass didn't need to point north. It needed to show bias to remind you that direction is always relative. A radio didn't need to receive weather reports. It needed copper that sang in the wind. A camera didn't need to record. Humans, it needed to erase them so the land could be seen clearly again. They were teaching our tools to be honest, and that's what scared me most. On the 6th day, I went back. This time, I brought 3 things: a small cassette recorder, the kind with a built-in microphone, and a belt clip that you could buy at a thrift store for $5, a blank 60-minute tape, and 100 feet of paracord. I also brought patience. I returned to the gallery first, boots off, moving slowly across the fern mat. The interior was exactly as I'd left it. Same objects on the walls, same mosaic at the back. But there was one new addition. Hanging from the lattice near the entrance was the disposable camera I'd been photographed with. The film counter now read 0. It had been used completely, and next to it, clipped to the same braided cord, was a small brown envelope, the kind that photolabs use to return developed prints. I didn't open it. Not yet. That felt like something I needed to earn. Instead, I sat down in the center of the space, cross-legged on the ferns, and set the cassette recorder on the ground in front of me. I pressed record. Then I spoke. "My name is Elias. I'm here to listen. If you want to teach me something, I'm ready." I pressed stop. Then I rewound the tape halfway so the message would be in the middle, and I pressed play. My voice came out tinny and small in the enclosed space. I let it finish, then I turned the recorder off, set it on a flat stone near the back wall, and left. I didn't go far. I walked about 60 yards upslope and found a sitting log with a clear sightline back to the root ball. I hunkered down, pulled my jacket hood up, and waited. 2 hours passed. A Douglas squirrel worked a cone in the branches above me. A raven called twice from the ridge. The light shifted, grayed, softened. Then I saw movement. It came from upslope, moving through the timber with a gait that was smooth and strangely upright, not hunched, not knuckle-walking, but bipedal in a way that looked effortless. It was massive. Easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, shoulders broad as a doorframe, arms long and loosely swinging. The hair was dark brown, almost black, shaggy and uneven, and the head, the head, was crested, the skull rising into a pronounced sagittal ridge that caught the light like a dorsal fin. It stopped at the entrance to the gallery, crouched, looked left, then right. Then it ducked inside. I held my breath. 30 seconds later, I heard it, the cassette player clicking on, my voice, tinny and distant. "My name is Elias. I'm here to listen." Silence. Then the sound of the tape being rewound. Not all the way. Just a few seconds. A pause. Then my voice again, but altered, slowed down, deepened. The pitch dropped an octave, and the cadence stretched, like someone had pulled taffy out of the syllables. "Elias, here, listen." The tape stopped. Then I heard something else. A voice, not mine. It was low, resonant, shaped like speech, but not quite words. Vowels that bent and rose and fell like a question. And underneath it, a rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, the same pattern I'd heard in the static days before. It was answering me. Then the figure emerged, the recorder in one hand. It walked to the nurse log, set the recorder down gently, and pressed a button. The tape ejected. The figure held the cassette up to the light, turning it slowly, studying the twin spools inside the clear plastic window. Then it set the tape on the log, pulled a thin piece of braided grass from somewhere behind its back, and threaded it through the center holes of the spools, tying them together like a necklace. It hung the cassette from a low branch. When the wind moved, the tape spools clicked softly together, the same ceramic sound I'd heard from the SD cards in the gallery. Then it turned and looked directly at me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. It raised one hand, not in threat, but palm out, fingers spread. It held the gesture for 5 long seconds. Then it turned and walked up a slope, silent, and disappeared into the timber. I waited until I couldn't hear anything but my own heartbeat. Then I walked to the log. The recorder was still there. The cassette was gone, now hanging from the branch, swaying gently. But next to the recorder, placed with deliberate care, was something new. A small handheld mirror, the kind you'd find in a camping kit, The glass was intact, but the back had been carved, scratched, really, with the same concentric spiral pattern I'd seen on the compasses. I picked it up and looked at my reflection. My face was distorted, bent by the scratches, pulled toward the center. My eyes looked too wide, my mouth too small. I looked like prey. I set the mirror down and picked up the recorder. I pressed rewind, waited, then pressed play. The tape hissed. Then I heard my voice, slow and deep, the way it had been manipulated. Then I heard the other voice, the low, vowel-bent response. Then something else. Footsteps, recorded, circling the microphone, close enough that I could hear the soft compression of fern and soil, and underneath, so faint I almost missed it. Breathing, slow, controlled, measured in a way that felt like counting. Then my voice again, not manipulated this time. Clear. But I hadn't said these words on the tape. They take what tells on them. They make it tell on us instead. It was Mabel's voice, copied, played back through my register. The tape ended. I stood there, recorder in hand, and felt the forest tilt. They weren't just collecting our technology, they were sampling us, recording our voices, learning our cadence, our breath, our patterns, and they were using our own tools to mirror us back to ourselves, distorted, fragmented, stripped down to something we didn't recognize. And the worst part? I realized they were right. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the mirror, the scratches, the way my face had bent inward toward the center, like a black hole of attention. So I started looking through the reports again, cross-referencing locations and dates. And that's when I saw it. 3 separate incidents over the last 18 months. Hikers reporting phantom headlamps on trails after dark, lights that bobbed and weaved just off the main path, close enough to follow, but always out of reach. 2 of the hikers followed the lights and got turned around. One ended up a mile off trail before her GPS pulled her back. Another had to be extracted by SAR after spending a night in a drainage he swore he'd never entered. But here's the thing. In both cases, the hikers reported that when they got close to the light, it would blink, not randomly, in a pattern, 3 blinks, pause, 2 blinks, the same rhythm. I grabbed my keys and drove back out to Forest Road 46. I parked at the gate and hiked in by headlamp, moving fast, not caring about noise. I had a theory, and I needed to test it before I lost my nerve. I reached the saddle above Butter Creek just after 10 p.m. It was a natural choke point, a narrow ridgeline where the main trail passed between 2 steep slopes. If you wanted to observe hikers without being seen, this is where you'd do it. I turned off my headlamp and waited. 20 minutes later, I saw it. A light. Faint, flickering, maybe 100 yards downslope to my left. It bobbed once, twice, then blinked. 3. Pause. 2. I didn't follow it. Instead, I circled wide, moving through the brush as quietly as I could, and approached from the side. When I got close, I saw what it was. A headlamp. A black diamond spot, the same model I used. It was hanging from a branch about 6 feet off the ground, suspended by braided grass, and the elastic strap had been tied into a loose knot so it swung gently in the breeze. But it wasn't on a timer. It was being operated. Behind the tree, crouched low and absolutely still, was a figure, smaller than the one I'd seen at the gallery, maybe 6 feet tall, leaner, with lighter hair that caught the faint moonlight. It held something in one hand. I couldn't see clearly, but it looked like a small twig. As I watched, it reached up and tapped the headlamp's button with the twig. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. The light blinked in sequence. Then it waited. I realized what I was watching: a lure, a trap. Not for prey, but for curiosity. It was calling to hikers the way we call to animals, using our own signals, our own tools, testing to see who would follow, who would break pattern, who would leave the trail. And beneath the headlamp, arranged in a loose crescent on the ground, was a net. Not a physical net, a field of objects. Fishing lines strung between branches at ankle height, small bells made from aluminum tabs, hung at intervals so quiet you wouldn't hear them until you stepped through. And in the center, a flat stone where anyone who followed the light would naturally step. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to collect. When someone followed the light, stumbled on the line, and dropped something, a phone, a key, a glove, the figure would wait, watch, retrieve, study. I backed away slowly, one step at a time, and didn't turn on my headlamp until I was 200 yards clear. The next morning, I went back to Mabel's house. I told her everything: the gallery, the cassette, the lure on the ridge, the net of fishing line. When I finished, she poured herself a second cup of coffee and stared out the window for a long time. "Do you know what the old-timers used to call them?" she asked finally. "No, the unteachers." She turned to face me. "Because they don't teach you something new. They unteach you what you thought you knew. They take your tools and show you what they actually do, what they cost, what you stopped noticing when you started trusting them more than your own senses. You think that's what this is? A lesson? I think it's a warning." She set her mug down. "We've been mapping this forest for 100 years, Elias. We've gridded it, named it, tagged it, tracked it. We've made it legible, controlled. And maybe something out there has decided it's time to make us legible instead." I thought about the mosaic, the 100 black mirrors, my face, fragmented and reflected. What do I do? She looked at me with something close to pity. "You go back, and you let them finish." I went back 3 days later, and this time I brought nothing. No recorder, no camera, no phone, not even a watch. I left everything in my truck except the clothes on my back and a single item I'd spent 2 days preparing: my grandfather's old field watch, a silver Elgin with a cracked crystal, and a second hand that hadn't moved since I was 12. I'd opened the back with a jeweler's screwdriver, carefully removed the minute hand with needle-nose pliers, and set the hour hand to 6. First light, the time when the forest exhales and the world is suspended between dark and day. It felt like the right gesture, an offering that acknowledged what I'd learned. I hiked in just after dawn, the air cold enough that my breath clouded, and the trail was empty. No birdsong yet, no wind, just the crunch of frost under my boots and the slow leak of gray light through the canopy. When I reached the clearing above the ravine, I stopped. The braided grass pointer was gone. The branch where it had hung was bare, the bark smooth as if nothing had ever been tied there. For a moment, I thought I'd misremembered the location. But then I saw the second sign, a line of small white stones, each one the size of a marble, placed at intervals along the ground, leading downslope toward the wind-thrown cedar. I followed them. The stones led me past the hemlock with the earbud, past the cairn with the disassembled watch, all the way to the root ball. But when I arrived, I saw that the entrance had changed. The fern mat was still there, overlapping and green, but across the threshold, hung at head height between the two root arches, was a curtain of sorts. It was made from strips of translucent plastic, the kind you'd find on old VHS tape or cassette tape, woven together into a loose screen. When the light hit it, the strips shimmered brown and amber, and I could see through them into the gallery beyond. I crouched, pulled off my boots, and set them beside the entrance. Then I reached out and touched the curtain. It rustled softly, a dry whisper, and swayed inward. I pushed through. Inside, the gallery had been rearranged. The objects were still there, earbuds, compasses, radios, SD cards, but now they were grouped differently. Everything that tracked or navigated was clustered on the left wall: compasses, GPS units, a handheld radio with its antenna extended. Everything that recorded or reflected was on the right: cameras, screens, mirrors, the Polaroid with the faces scratched off. And at the back, the mosaic had changed shape. It was no longer a broad oval. Now it formed a narrow corridor, a passage made of overlapping black screens angled inward like the walls of a funnel or the throat of a fish weir. The sides tapered gradually, and at the far end, maybe 6 feet deep, the passage opened into a small circular space just wide enough for one person to stand. I understood immediately. It was an invitation. I moved forward slowly, staying low, and entered the passage. The screens on either side reflected me in fragments as I passed: my shoulder, my hand, the side of my face. But the reflections were cleaner now, sharper, because the gallery was darker than before. Someone had woven a lattice of branches across the gaps in the root system above, filtering the light down to a soft twilight glow. When I reached the end of the passage, I stood up carefully in the circular space and turned to face back the way I'd come. That's when I saw it. The mosaic wasn't just a tunnel. It was a mirror array designed to show you yourself from every angle at once. Standing in the center, I could see my front, my back, both profiles, the top of my head, even the underside of my jaw, all reflected in the faceted black screen surrounding me. I was everywhere and nowhere, broken into 100 pieces, reassembled into something that looked human but felt utterly alien. And then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the fern mat behind me. I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the mosaic, watching the reflection shift as something large moved into the passage behind me. It stopped just outside the circular space. I could see its outline in the screens: broad shoulders, crested head, long arms hanging loose at its sides. It was close enough that I could hear its breathing, deep and even, and smell that familiar scent: fern, stone, musk. Then it moved. One arm extended slowly into the circular space, palm open. In its hand were 3 objects arranged in a line across its skin like gifts on an altar. The first was a micro SD card unrolled from its plastic case, the tiny gold contacts gleaming. The second was a compass face, pried free from its housing, the transparent dial scratched with the same spiral pattern I'd seen before. The third was a strip of reflective foil, maybe 2 inches long, creased down the middle. It held him there, motionless, waiting. I reached out slowly and touched the foil. It was warm. The figure pulled its hand back slightly, then rotated the foil so the crease caught the light. The reflection split, one beam toward me, one beam toward the mosaic wall. Then it placed the foil on the ground, reflective side down, and pressed it flat with one thick finger. Next, it lifted the compass face and held it up to the nearest screen. The scratches on the dial lined up with scratches on the screen, concentric rings, mirrored, forming a nested spiral that drew the eye inward. It tapped the glass twice, gently, then set the compass face on top of the foil. Finally, It took the micro SD card and threaded it onto a strand of braided grass that had been looped around one of the lattice branches. The card dangled, spinning slowly, and when it rotated, it caught the dim light and clicked softly against the wood. Then the figure pointed 3 times, first toward my chest, second toward the mosaic, third toward one of the black screens where a triangular gap had been cut into the glass, a deliberate absence, a hole where a human face would be reflected if you stood in just the right position. I looked at the hole, then at the mosaic, then at the objects on the ground, and slowly, carefully, I understood. This wasn't a threat. It was a lesson. The foil placed face down. Look at how you present yourself. See what you hide. The compass scratched into spirals. Your tools point where you tell them to. They reflect your bias, not truth. The SD card, threaded and spinning. You collect and collect, but you don't listen. You store sound and call it memory. And the hole in the mosaic, the absence where eyes should be, you look, but you do not see. You watch yourself and call it observation. They weren't afraid of our technology. They were afraid of what it had done to us, how it had made us blind to the world we moved through, how it had turned us inward, how it had taught us to trust the map more than the ground, the screen more than the sky, the recording more than the lived moment. So they took our tools and translated them into lessons. They biased our compasses to humility. They erased our faces from photographs so we'd stop centering ourselves. They dismantled our radios and retuned the copper so it would sing with the wind instead of drown it out. They hung our screens in the dark to show us what we looked like when we stopped performing for the lens. They were teaching our technology to teach us. And the curriculum was simplicity, presence, and the kind of attention that doesn't need to be recorded to be real. I placed my hand over my heart, then extended it palm out toward the figure, the way it had gestured to me days before on the ridge. The figure held still for a long moment. Then it stepped forward into the circular space with me. I had to tilt my head back to see its face. The brow was heavy, sloped, shadowed. The eyes were deep-set, dark, and unreadable. The nose was broad and flat. The mouth was closed, lips pressed into a firm line. It wasn't aggression, it was assessment. It reached past me slowly and lifted one of the black screens from the mosaic wall. The screen had been mounted on a thin frame of stripped willow, and when the figure turned it, I saw that the back had been carved. Not scratched, carved. Deep, deliberate grooves forming a pattern I recognized immediately. A topographic map. Contour lines, ridges, drainages. But there were no labels, no trail names, no human reference points. Just the shape of the land, rendered in wood with a precision that would have taken days. The figure held it up so I could see both sides at once. The black reflective screen on one side, the carved map on the other. Then it turned the frame and held it so the map faced me and the screen faced outward toward the forest. A question, a demonstration. Which side do you trust? The one that shows you yourself or the one that shows you the world? I reached into my pocket and pulled out my grandfather's watch. I held it in my open palm, hour hand frozen at 6, minute hand gone, crystal cracked. The figure looked at it. Then, very gently, it took the watch from my hand. It turned the watch over, examining the back, then the face. It tapped the crystal twice, softly, and the cracked glass rattled. Then it did something I didn't expect. It smiled, not a human smile. The lips didn't pull back. The teeth didn't show. but the eyes narrowed slightly, the corners crinkling, and there was a warmth there, a recognition. It reached behind its back and pulled something from a concealed fold in the matted hair along its shoulder. A drawstring pouch, small and lumpy, made from woven grass so fine it looked like fabric. It opened the pouch and shook 3 objects into its palm. The first was a watch hand, brass, tarnished, the kind you'd find in an old pocket watch, just the hour hand. The second was a small spring, tightly coiled, no longer than my thumbnail. The third was a tiny gear, maybe a 1/4 inch across, with teeth so fine they looked like lace. The figure placed my grandfather's watch on the ground, then arranged the 3 objects around it in a triangle, the hour hand pointing upslope, the spring to the left, the gear to the right. Then it pressed 1 finger to the watch face, holding it in place, and with the other hand it wound the spring between 2 fingers, compressing it, then released it. The spring bounced once softly and clicked against the watch crystal. The figure looked at me, pointed to the spring, then to the forest around us. Time doesn't need a dial. It moves whether you measure it or not. I nodded slowly. The figure gathered the objects, returned them to the pouch, and tucked the pouch back into its shoulder. But it kept my grandfather's watch. It held it up to the light one more time, turning it, then threaded a strand of braided grass through the watch's pin and hung it from a lattice branch at the very back of the circular space, right at the throat of the mosaic, where the passage narrowed. Dawn, fixed forever, where humans try to pass. Then it placed 1 hand flat against its own chest and held it there for 3 long breaths. I mirrored the gesture. It stepped back, ducked, and moved through the passage toward the entrance. I followed, staying low, and when we both emerged into the gray morning light, it stood at full height and raised 1 hand. Not a wave, a benediction. Slow, deliberate, palm open. Then it reached up to a branch above the entrance and pulled a strand of braided grass tight. Somewhere high on the ridge, a sound rang out, clear, resonant, musical, a copper coil singing in the wind. The note held for 5 seconds, then faded. The figure turned and walked up slope, moving through the timber with that same effortless gait, and within 30 seconds it had disappeared completely. No sound, no broken branches, just gone. I stood there for a long time, breathing the cold air, listening to the forest wake around me. Then I walked back to my truck. When I reached the clearing where I'd parked, I found something on the driver's seat. The door had been locked, I was sure of it, but sitting in the center of the seat, placed with care, was my handheld GPS, the Garmin E-Trex I'd left as an offering weeks before. I picked it up and turned it on. The screen lit up, pale green in the morning shadows, but the map was gone. No roads, no trails, no waypoints, no grid, just a flat gray field with a single pulsing dot in the center. The dot moved when I moved, faster when I breathed hard, slower when I held still. It wasn't tracking my location, it was tracking my heartbeat. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the weight of the device in my hand, watching the dot pulse in rhythm with the blood in my veins. Then I turned it off. I set it on the dashboard, started the truck, and drove back toward Packwood with the windows down and the radio off, listening to nothing but the sound of gravel under the tires and the wind moving through the trees. For the first time in years, I didn't need a map to know where I was. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a ranger I knew at the Cowlitz Valley Station. He said a hiker had found something strange on the Butter Creek Trail and wanted to know if I'd heard anything similar. I told him I'd look into it. The hiker had uploaded a photo to a forum. It showed a tree at a trail junction, a young Douglas fir with smooth bark. Hanging from one of the lower branches was a smartphone, an iPhone 4, scratched and weathered, dangling from braided grass. The screen was cracked, but it had been polished, and in the reflection you could see the hiker's own face staring back, wide-eyed and small. Beneath the phone, arranged on a flat stone, were three objects: a compass with a scratched face, a micro SD card on a loop of grass, and a small folded square of reflective foil. The hiker wrote, "I don't know what this means, but I felt like I wasn't supposed to touch it, like it was a lesson I hadn't learned yet." I closed the browser and didn't reply, because I understood now. They don't break our technology. They don't fear it. They don't even reject it. They unteach it. They take the tools we use to conquer the world and reshape them into tools that teach us humility. They turn our compasses inward, our cameras outward, our maps into mirrors. They force us to see what we've stopped noticing: the wind, the quiet, the rhythm of a living system we named and measured and then forgot how to listen to. And if we're lucky, the lesson breaks through just in time, before we forget we were ever part of the forest at all. I still go back sometimes, not to the gallery. I haven't been inside since that morning, but to the clearing above the ravine. I leave small offerings on the flat stone where the compass once sat: batteries, broken screens, a cassette tape with a ribbon pulled out and coiled like a nest. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the forest is still, I hear it. 3 bursts, 2 bursts. Pause. Not static anymore. A copper coil, singing somewhere high on the ridge, tuned to the exact pitch of the valley breathing beneath my feet. And I know they're still out there, still watching, still learning, still teaching our tools to be honest, still reminding us, one cracked screen at a time, that the most dangerous thing we ever invented wasn't the device. It was the belief that we could see the world clearly without learning to see ourselves first.